Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Bob the Bookerer, and today I wanted to go over some of my top fiction books from this year. And just like with the non-fiction book list, I've tried to narrow it down slightly somehow, sort of, by mostly looking at, by only looking at books released this year. And so as a result, there have been quite a few books that I've kind of cut that otherwise have been absolute favourites of mine from this year, but technically weren't really released this year. And so, yeah, all of that jazz. But there have been so many books that I have just absolutely loved. I feel like it has been an incredibly strong year for fiction. I feel like it's easy to say that pretty much every year because there are so many people writing and so many people writing incredible work as well. That it feels like it's maybe sort of churlish to kind of say like it's a good year. But anyway, there have been a lot of books I've really strongly enjoyed this year, and in trying to get down to this list, I kind of looked at all of the books I'd given kind of, you know, top ratings to, like 5-star ratings to, and kind of narrowed those down by ones released this year. And then trying to narrow it down further has been which ones I have sort of stayed with me most, or have had where I've had the sort of biggest reaction to them. And so it's been a tricky one, but here we go. Let's see how this list works. It was going to be a top 10. I eventually decided on 12 just because I couldn't really decide, and I thought 12 is a nice enough number. So there we go. Let's see. First up, it should come as no surprise to people who've sort of been watching throughout the year that this book has sort of still stayed with me. It's a book I've mentioned a lot. It is Dinner Party, A Tragedy by Sarah Gilmartin. It's a book that I absolutely adored when I first read it, and I really want to go and reread it at some point. It focuses in on this family who have had sort of various bits of loss, and they meet every Halloween as it happens, which is the sort of anniversary of somebody's death, to kind of come together. But there's this real clever sort of family dynamic throughout it that I thought was really, really powerfully done, because we've got kind of, you know, siblings who kind of squabble and kind of are both there for each other, but also sort of a bit done with each other. You've got these sort of strained relationships with parents. I just thought it was really, really beautifully done. The writing of it is so visceral at times. There is this gorgeous moment towards the beginning where the language mirrors the kind of scene in such a perfect way. You sort of get the sense that this character is a bit of a perfectionist based entirely on how their language is, because it's so precise and there's such a sort of cuttingness to it. And then when we later find out that the character has an eating disorder, the two actually kind of come together really interestingly, of sort of thinking actually the kind of perfectionism and kind of rule-based system almost of somebody in the throes of an eating disorder are sort of really powerfully mirrored in the language here. And I thought this book is really cleverly done. It avoided so many sort of pitfalls for me in terms of how it tied up the ending. And I really loved it. And I think she's a debut author, if I'm right, and which makes this even more extraordinary. I can't wait to see what more she has to come, because this book just absolutely blew my mind and I loved it. Next up, and you'll sort of notice because I'm sort of going chronologically from when I read them, to some degree, but Robert Jones Jr.'s The Prophets. And it's really interesting. This is a book that there was so much fanfare for early in the year, and it just it didn't really get a lot of the prize attention I would have expected for it, which is very strange because I just think this book's brilliant. So this book, again, a debut book, focuses in on the relationship between these two men, these two enslaved men in the US. And it's particularly powerful just because of how it is all handled. There's this really clever moment where we sort of see an interaction between what it looks like for a sort of a white gay man in this time versus for them, and that's played really cleverly in the book, and the kind of the ways that that sort of abuse and violence is perpetrated, even sort of less directly, I guess. And then there are all these other really gorgeous moments. But I think at the heart of it, these two men and their relationship is just so beautifully done and so pure. But also just there's this really interesting sort of discussion there as well about ancestors and this sort of spiritual home and all these sorts of other things going on that I thought just made this such a clever book. and just a book that I haven't really stopped thinking about too much since I read it quite early this year. I just think it's astounding, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading more from Robert Jones Jr. in the future. Next up, with a slightly different change, well, sort of change of pace really, Jordan Tannahill's The Listeners. And so this book I thought was so good and so clever and so fun for so many reasons. So this book focuses in on, it starts with this one woman who can hear a sort of a faint humming noise in the background, and nobody else seemingly can. So she sort of starts thinking, you know, at first she's sort of willing to sort of dismiss it and think, oh, maybe I've got something in my ear or whatever, and she visits various doctors, but nothing's really happening. You know, the hum is still there. And then she sort of starts becoming more and more isolated from her family as a result, because they sort of think, oh, you know, what's she doing? But kind of as a result, you know, her irritability, you know, from lack of sleep and various other things, mean that there's a real complication there. And what, for me, just makes this book so clever is then the second part, where essentially she is now enmeshed in a sort of group of people who can all hear this sound, but it starts to resemble a bit of a cult, and we suddenly get this really interesting play here of the sort of in-group and out-group, and it is basically like going inside the mind of somebody who's sort of bought into a conspiracy theory. And I think what sets this book apart, I think for me, is that Jordan Tannahill is so empathetic and generous to his characters. So even when we're inside the mind of a woman who's potentially not very well, who is sort of getting only, you know, whose sort of entire life is dominated by this sound and the community that she's found from other people who can hear it, there's still something of understanding in there, that we understand that she's vulnerable, and that part of her being in there is that this gives her a security she's otherwise never had. But also, that all aside, she is we kind of start to see almost the logic to her pattern of thought. In her mind, that logic follows quite simply, and it makes a lot of sense. And so it's really interesting to see how this book handles it. And I thought this book was so cleverly done. Completely not what I expected when I got an advance copy of this. I thought it was going to be about something entirely different, and I loved how this book was pieced together. Next up was a book that I absolutely adored, and again have spoken about so much this year. Apologies. And that book is Detransition Baby by Torrey. And I think what I adore about this book so much, apart from the fact that it is a trans writer writing trans characters in a way that I don't think I've seen done before, it's also just that there is this real bawdiness and silliness and absurdity balanced alongside something so poignant and so powerful. So the core story is about a character who essentially accidentally impregnates someone, thinking that they are no longer able to kind of, basically thinking they're infertile because of their transition. And so that then kind of leads to this really strange moment of this sort of happens, and what does it look like? And I mean, the book sort of name checks Sex and the City a couple of times, and I think actually that's quite fitting. It feels that kind of level of absurdity and kind of campery and silliness that goes on in this book, and I just loved it. I think there is a funeral scene that is just incredibly poignant, and then followed up by a really brilliant gag. There is there's so much to love about this book, but I saw someone online, I think on Goodreads or something, call it Not in Front of the Cis, as in kind of how trans people talk when there aren't cis people present. And I thought this was really cleverly, that was a really astute point, because that's exactly how this book feels. There is a real sense, at least to me, of kind of hearing it from the inside. We're not only through the sort of interior lives and sort of inner lives of these characters, but also just watching their conversations as they sort of unfold between each other. And it plays with so many things. It's so messy and silly and absurd, and I loved it. And I just think this is such a brilliant book, and it's the kind of book that I keep on sort of recommending to people, just because it's it's so brilliant. I love it. But at the same time, the sad moments are even sadder as a result of all of the hilarity that goes on in this book. And the funny moments are even funnier because of all the sad moments. It's so brilliantly handled for me. It's a bit of a mess, but I kind of love the messiness of this book. And I think that's kind of part of its appeal, really. Next up, in terms of another book that was also kind of wonderfully messy and absurd, is Nightbitch by Rachel Yoder. And this book I just think is so much fun, whilst also being incredibly dark. Essentially, the main premise of this book, and there's a brilliant video on it as well by Fraser Simons if you get a chance to check it out as well. But the main premise of this book is there is a woman who is sort of in some ways tired a little bit of the strictures of her life, of sort of the difficult place of being a woman and sort of having people police sort of quite a lot of parts of your behaviour. And at the sort of same time, she starts to sort of develop kind of quite sort of wolf-like features or kind of canine features. So at first that's sort of having a real desire to eat raw meat, and she can sort of start smelling blood, and there's something very primal and very raw about her life, and it kind of keeps developing where she sort of keeps on getting these wilder and wilder sort of urges, I guess, for want of a better word. And we basically get the sense of her slowly turning into some kind of dog wolf-like creature, including at one point sort of seemingly growing hair and all these other things. But what I think is really great about this book is it's very funny, and there are some centerpiece sort of moments of this book that are hilarious. There's basically at one point a Tupperware party or something that basically gets over, you know, that kind of gets invaded by all of this sort of thing happening. There's this sort of really bizarre story around like a cat and whether it's potentially about to get eaten. It's so many things happen in this book, and in quite, you know, it's about 250 pages or so. It's quite amazing how much of this gets packed in, and it's just so funny. But at the same time, the dark moments are so dark, and we get this really interesting view of what happens when this woman wants to kind of go primal or feral. And in many ways that feels like a real resistance to what she's told she can and can't do as a woman in modern day society, which is fascinating. So I really loved this, and it really stayed with me. I just thought it was, every time I've seen people picking this book up, I'm like, yes, this is great, please love it and enjoy it. It's such a wild ride. It really is wild, but yeah, it really stayed with me and is a book I absolutely adored. Next, we get into Booker territory. You knew it was coming. And I somehow managed to limit myself only to, I think, 3 from the shortlist. I really enjoyed this year's shortlist a lot more than normally I enjoy like a good number of them. But this year I had, I think, 4 books that I absolutely loved, and 2 books that I really enjoyed. So I was very happy. Anyway, we should probably start with the winner. Damon Galgut's The Promise, and this I did a sort of longer form discussion on this with Sean, so I won't go into too much detail now, but this book I think is just sublime. It tells the story of a South African family, and the central promise at the heart of this is that there is a piece of land that will be left to this black woman, and however this white South African family sort of seem to find ways throughout their time that they don't give this to her. And what's really interesting is this sort of book, through the microcosm of this South African family, sort of tells part of the history of South Africa, and particularly South Africa's relationship with issues around race. So we sort of see how at the beginning of the book the land can't be handed over to this woman, Salome, I think, because of the rules. Like, it's not legally allowed to pass on property to black people in that time. But then actually once it does become legal, it still doesn't come to pass. And there's this really brilliant showdown at the end of the book where this is sort of brought up, and there's a proper discussion that goes on. But I think what's so brilliant about this book just hovers around this family, a bit kind of vulture-like almost, in a really great way. And the writing of this I just think is brilliant. I mean, I've only read one other book of his before, which I adored, but I think based on this as well, I need to read more Galgut. I think his work is just so brilliant, and he's just such an astute, clever writer. Next up, we also have the other two of the other books where, if they'd won the Booker, I would not have been angry in the slightest. Richard Powers with Bewilderment. Again, I've spoken about this as a separate video, so I'll kind of keep this brief. But essentially, the main sort of focus of this story is a man who, a man and his son. His son, sort of on the spectrum, and is really involved and really interested in protecting the environment, and sees the existential threat of that, perhaps differently to everybody else in his life. And the relationship between father and son in this book I just thought was so beautifully observed, because it's so caring, but also you just get the sense that they're both really mourning the loss of the child's mother. They're both really unsure about how to deal with everything in the world, and there's this sort of experimental treatment, for want of a better word, that aims to help the young boy sort of navigate sort of more neurotypical society. But it's really cleverly done, I think, and the writing of this is so beautiful. I think the more I just fell into this book, I just absolutely adored every sentence, the way that Richard Powers is able to construct things around these characters. I just thought was absolutely brilliant. And the other book that I'm going to mention, probably no surprise, is A Passage North by Anuk Arudpragasam. And this is not a book that I always found, like, it's not entirely perfect. There were passages that I was a bit on, but overall the book was so strong, especially in some parts, that really moved me, and where the writing was so crystal clear and focused and really thoughtful around specific ideas, particularly around loneliness, around this sort of woman, this older woman watching her life, watching the world around her from a window. And I haven't even really spoken about what the story is about, but the plot is fairly intentionally kind of quite limited. It is literally about a train journey and sort of going from one place to another. But in doing so, we, again, almost a bit like The Promise, we kind of get the history of Sri Lanka going on kind of in the background. And so again, he feels, the narrator himself feels like a visitor in his own life. He's sort of a tourist almost going through. So I just thought this book was really, really clever. And yes, I know I've been sort of rambling about how much I love it all year. It is great. I think even though there are passages that didn't always necessarily work for me, the bits that did were so brilliant for me that I was just in love. And yeah, I'm really glad that this book got shortlisted. I think it deserved a little nudge up there as well for me personally. Back to non-Booker Prize books for once, was another book that I read as an advance copy and absolutely adored, The Magician by Colm Toibin. And this, I mean, I love his writing anyway. Colm Toibin could write about he could write about the blandest things and I would be fully invested. But The Magician is the story of Thomas Mann, the German author. And this book really gripped me, just I think especially because of the beauty of the language, but also how Colm Toibin explored the inner life of a gay man who's sort of worried and is sort of full of shame, and how he captures that through his own lens. I think the thing that I love about Colm Toibin's character studies when he writes is he's very able to step back. You never really get the sense that Toibin sort of pulling the strings. It feels like the story really naturally unfolds, and you know, we particularly cover the point of time where Thomas Mann is he becomes quite famous, but then there's the rise of the Nazis, and he has to sort of work out if he wants to stay in a country that is his home, but also that is becoming increasingly hostile and alien. But also there's something so beautiful about Toibin as a gay writer, writing in the perspective of Thomas Mann, another gay writer. And there's this sort of real shared understanding between these two men that I just thought was brilliant. I loved this, and I got to the final passage of this book, because we follow Thomas Mann's whole entire life, so spoiler alert, he dies. He's not still alive, like 150 or something, however old he'd be. But I think what's so special about it is we're watching the end of this man's life, and Toibin is just so able to capture this family around him in such a beautiful, beautiful way. And I was just I was sat reading the final bit of this book in public, kind of almost weeping. I just think it's really, really, really good. It's such a good book. A very, very different book to probably many of the books on this list, actually. Natasha Brown's Assembly. This book is only about 100 pages long, and it basically it's quite a weird and fun experimental one in some ways. It plays around a lot with text on the page and in terms of how it presents ideas and thinks about things. But ostensibly, this is a sort of a book about a black woman working in kind of in finance, I believe it is, and she, part of her job is to basically go into schools and tell other people, particularly you know, people from ethnic minority backgrounds, that it's great, like the finance world is really easy to get into and to stay in if you're a person of color. It's all fine, you won't face any issues. And she is sort of at the same time is battling sort of racism within sort of her workplace, and feeling kind of burnt out and used up and everything. And she's kind of got these weird sort of microaggressions coming from her partner who's white and his family. And she at one point has this really brilliant, interesting observation of this man sort of feeling like he can sort of walk into a room and understand, like he just feels like he owns everything. He kind of has this sort of self-possessed nature that he just naturally belongs anywhere he goes in, and she's never really felt that. And all of this is then kind of complicated by a sort of medical diagnosis that takes place for her, and it starts to draw these parallels between the kind of sickness of this sort of society around her, and it almost feels like she's absorbed the sickness around her into her body. It's such a clever book in so many ways, and it plays around with bits of text. It'll sometimes, at one point, it puts the definition of black and white from the dictionary next to each other to look at kind of how white is often associated with purity and holiness, and black is often sort of associated with sort of malevolent spirits and things like that. So it's really, really, really cleverly done, and just such an oddball of a book that I was really glad to read this year. And now we come to part of the reason why this couldn't just be a top 10 for me. We have a couple of latecomers that I've read in the last couple of weeks, and I don't think that the list would feel complete without these two books on there. So first up is a book that I was really keen to get round to read, and I'd really also highly recommend you check out Eric's video on this, and I'll leave a link to it below. Claire Keegan's Small Things Like These. This is, again, a tiny little book. It's about 100 pages. But deceptively powerful within those 100 pages. This book covers a lot around the Magdalen laundries and sort of a time in Ireland's history where often children were given up for, well, essentially abortion wasn't allowed, and so often women who fell pregnant would be kind of left in this weird middle ground, because they would either have to travel abroad travel to England to go and get an abortion, or they would have to carry the baby to term, and often then would have to give it up for adoption. But what it essentially ended up being often is that if the woman wanted to keep it, basically the woman would have very few other life chances and would end up in a sort of essentially working with nuns, just to be able to kind of make ends meet, seemingly, and to be able to look after the kid. But actually those places were rife with abuse and with many other things going on that were horrific. And this book covers that part of the history really, really well. And again, only 100 pages, but very beautifully, through very small descriptions of certain areas or ideas, covers sort of a couple of characters' lives as they navigate it. And it's heartbreaking because this book doesn't really reveal what it's doing until fairly late in the book. And again, it's almost 100 pages, right? So it's quite short. But when that sort of penny drops and you kind of realise what's happening with a few of these characters, it's utterly heartbreaking. And I really don't know how she does this in 100 pages. I'm incredibly envious as someone who writes. But I'm just blown away by it. I think this is easily one of the sort of sleeper hits of the year, actually. I think it's going to be one of those books that people probably discover a bit going into next year, hopefully, and for good reason. I think it's beautiful. I really, really urge you to check it out. It does so much so well, and I love it. And last but definitely not least, a book that, again, mentioning Eric, he recommended, because I know that he'd been speaking about this author before, and very rightly said that I would enjoy this author's work. This is Neil Bartlett with Address Book, and I knew very, very little about this book before going in, but essentially it's a set of mini stories that are kind of interconnected in almost kind of more of a novel way. It doesn't feel like individual short stories, and the idea is that we follow these addresses of various places, particularly in London, where there is some kind of interaction with queer characters, and the sort of slow unveiling of how these things are kind of interconnected in some way, but the main idea for how they essentially are is that there's a kind of shared queer experience that kind of sort of patterns through history that really work in this book. So, for example, the book kind of, one of the final ones is looking at a same-sex wedding. But earlier in the book, we've got kind of characters sort of in much more sort of dire straits. And what I think is brilliant is we basically sort of see a sort of map of queer history in London through these characters and through these addresses very specifically. There are a couple of passages in this that just left me breathless. It is so beautiful. It's an absolutely stunning book. There are characters talking. I'm getting a bit emotional just thinking about this, actually. Gosh, but some characters who are basically almost, you know, facing down the barrel of a gun in terms of their identity, in terms of their lives, and the resilience of it, and the fight that they have in them to keep going, but also these really powerful sense of shame and of loss. We of course, you know, delve a little bit into the HIV sort of crisis, particularly in the sort of 80s and sort of early 90s in this book. And again, it does this in such a sensitive, brilliant way of, I think, articulating just the kind of the scale of that loss on kind of a national level and a sort of personal level for people, and the kind of survivor's guilt of characters who didn't die, of people who didn't die during that time. So I think this book is just stunning. It was just such a beautiful kind of end of year read for me of, you know, work was winding down. I just sat and I read this and I just devoured it. And I think it's beautiful. It's just, because we get each character that we meet, we kind of hear things in their style, and there are characters who are trying to come to terms with having a queer neighbour. There are characters who are, you know, watching a wedding taking place and kind of trying to understand it. And so I think there's something so generous and loving about getting that perspective as well, of people who are outside of the queer community also looking in, and kind of how did they see it at this time. I thought this was an absolutely beautiful piece of writing, and I really, really highly recommend it. Now that I've stopped myself from being too weepy after that last one, those are my books of the year. There are many, many other books that I didn't mention because it's been a great year for reading. I think looking through, I think I gave 5 stars to quite a lot of books this year, and I think fiction, particularly in times of turbulence like we've kind of been living through, have been a real sort of, you know, it's a real way of grounding you. And I think so many brilliant books have come out this year, and we've got so many fantastic books, I'm sure, coming out next year, that I'm very, very much looking forward to. I've been Bob. Please do let me know some of your favourite books from this year. I'd love to hear them. Have you read any of the ones I've mentioned? I hope you've had a wonderful year. I hope that 2022 is a good one for you as well, both in terms of reading and, you know, general life. Take care and look after yourselves. Bye bye.